I love to tell the story of unseen things above, of Jesus and His glory, of Jesus and His love. I love to tell the story because I know 'tis true. It satisfies my longings as nothing else can do. I love to tell the story, 'twill be my theme in glory, to tell the old story of Jesus and His love.
Does anybody know what this picture represents? Most people? This is from 1986. The Challenger space shuttle, on its 10th mission, blew up 1 minute and I think 17 seconds after launch. I was standing in my front yard in Central Florida watching this go up. And it's a picture you'll never forget. It's a very memorable moment. Do you know what went wrong with the Challenger launch? O-rings, whatever those things are. It's like a washer in your hose, connecting a hose to this faucet. It's a more flexible material so that the joint between the metal things will not leak. But there was a leak on an O-ring. We're going to talk about that a little bit in a moment because it fits with our lesson, believe it or not. What about this one? A little less memorable, but it's a more recent picture. Columbia on its 28th mission in 2003. Actually, this was, I think, the 117th space shuttle flight. So a lot of flights have taken place. But with this flight, the first mission was in 1981. So the shuttle Columbia itself had been flying for almost 22 years and had flown 27 successful missions. But on its 28th mission, it exploded over Texas and then disintegrated over Texas and Louisiana. And what was the cause of the problem with Columbia? The heat shield. There was a problem with foam breaking off and hitting the heat shield and destroying it. This is a picture of the shuttle to give you an idea of the size. I looked out my office window one day in Houston, Texas, and saw this flying by my window as they were delivering it. For a while early on, they would land at Edwards Air Force Base in California and then fly it back to Cape Canaveral in order to launch for the next time around. And so they would put it on the back of a 747. Now, this is a 747 plane. That is a big plane. If you have flown at all, you know that is a huge plane. And you see the size of the shuttle relative to that. It's a big shuttle. They would have, a typical flight crew was seven people living on that for sometimes 2 to 3 weeks, orbiting the Earth. But it's a big vehicle, and you see it here relative to a 747. This is the Challenger on the launch pad before that fatal launch. There are 4 components. You have the space shuttle itself. You have 2 white things here on the side. Those are the booster rockets that give the power to take all this beyond the Earth's atmosphere and get it out there where it can orbit around the Earth. With this thing in the middle is the fuel tank. I mean, it supplies the fuel for those booster rockets to get this thing out. Think about the size of that fuel tank compared to that 747. Pretty close to the same size. And so it would be like flying on the back of a 747 loaded with fuel, where the cabin is full of fuel. That's a lot of fuel. Imagine driving your car with, on the top of it, something twice as big as your car loaded with gasoline. And then imagine that exploding. That's what happened 1 minute after the launch. The O-ring gave way. Now, this was not the first space shuttle flight. The Challenger itself had had several successful flights, but it was about the 25th shuttle flight. But they had had a problem with the O-rings on almost every flight. So this was not a new problem. With the Columbia, problem was on launch again, some foam broke off this tank and hit the wing of the shuttle and broke the heat shield. The fuel is stored at more than 400 degrees below zero. So it's cold stuff. And if you just had a tank of that sitting out in the warm, humid Florida air, ice would form over that thing immediately. So they put foam around the tank, almost like your styrofoam cup that you have for your coffee. But it's foam around the tank to keep it from icing up. Now, with the Columbia, they had more than 100 flights prior to that, and there was a problem with the foam on every one of those flights. Foam would break off, and concern was always it would hit the shuttle and hurt the heat shield. Well, for over 100 flights, the foam would break off and hit the shuttle, and no problem. Now, the heat shield's important because when it comes back into the Earth's atmosphere, it hits a temperature of about 10,000 degrees. Now, that's a little hotter than your oven gets. So if that heat shield isn't working, then kabooey. What happened, of course, the heat shield failed and it just exploded. And so all those pieces flew over Texas and Louisiana. So here's the problem. These were not new problems. They had been there all along. They were of grave concern in the beginning, but as time went along, it was less and less of a problem in the eyes of the engineers. As they studied those two cases, the engineers who studied it came up with a phrase to describe what took place in the minds of the people who were doing the launch. And they called it normalized deviance. The normalized deviance. This is a great problem in any compromise that we make. Now, that's what they did. They compromised. They had a problem in the beginning with O-rings and with the foam around the tank. They were gravely concerned about it in the beginning, but as time went along, it never created a problem, a disastrous problem. It was okay. And they learned to live with it. They accepted it. It became normal until it didn't. So normalized deviance, basically you have something that is deviant. It's different. It's not what you expect and not what you like. I mean, in a perfect launch, your O-rings would always work perfectly and the foam on your tank would not break off and hit your shuttle and everything would be fine. But deviance exists. So what happens is after a while you play with that and you become a little more tolerant of it. It becomes acceptable. And if you do it enough, then it becomes normal. Until it isn't, and there's a disaster at the end. In a really bad compromising situation, we're going to have the same thing. We're going to have something that's deviant, and we come to accept it a little bit, then we accept it more, and then we sort of see it as normal until it isn't. Can you think of any social issues of the day that might be deviant, which we are calling now acceptable or even normal? And might there be a cost to those compromises that we make along the way with a price to be paid somewhere along the line? We're going to be talking about bad compromises and their cost. Now, that's what the engineers did. They made some compromises, and they turned out to be bad. You have to understand their situation a little bit, too. I mean, they have budget issues. I mean, there's a limit as to how much they can spend to solve a problem. They have time constraints. They have to get some things done in a certain period of time because there are political restraints on them as well. Politicians in Washington clamoring to make sure that we get this flight up. They have their problems, as we all have problems. As they face those, they may be forced to make some compromises along the way, as we may be forced in some situations to make some compromises. But we need to try to make sure that we don't make really bad compromises. So we're going to talk about them and their costs. We need to look at what the compromise is actually going to cost us. How do we decide when a compromise is a bad compromise? How do we decide that, yes, that was a bad compromise? We should not have compromised that. That was bad.
Usually when it's too late.
Usually when it's too late. Just like the engineers. I'm sure there were engineers clamoring to the bitter end that we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do this. But the decision was to go ahead. Often it is when the disaster happens. It is when we're thrown in jail because we did something that, well, I guess I really shouldn't have done that. Didn't realize that that could happen. But it's usually when the disaster comes, because as we make the compromise, it becomes acceptable to us, and then we even start to see it as normal. And so it is normalized deviance. Even good Christians make bad compromises. We're not making excuses now, but we do make bad compromises. Why?
They not have all the information they need. They just jump.
We don't have perfect knowledge. We cannot know everything, so we make decisions with best information that we have. And sometimes we have to make a compromise along the way. And so it can happen that we make a bad compromise, as the engineers at NASA did in 1986 and in 2003. What else?
Being too quick about it.
Sometimes we are just too fast because it looks good to us, doesn't it? I mean, something is very...
Jerk reaction.
I have to confess, I sometimes react way too quickly on something. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, although I would like to, because it's a very important question. The reason I'm not going to spend much time on it is because Steve is preaching a sermon this morning on Romans 7. Beautiful chapter, one of my favorite sections, Romans 7 and 8. And he's going to be preaching on Romans 7. I don't know where he's going with it. I don't know what he's going to do. I just happened to see the topic this morning. But I think he's going to explain to us why good Christians can make bad compromises. It is a matter of the old nature and the new nature. We have, even though the Holy Spirit has come to dwell within us, and we have that power within us to do the right thing and to live the right kind of life, that old nature is still there. The flesh is still with you. You know, we like to kind of hide it and not talk about it and not recognize it, but the flesh is still there. And as long as that flesh is there, we are very susceptible to making bad compromises, making bad decisions, moving too quickly, doing it in all kinds of ways. I'll defer to Steve for the rest of that sermon. I think that many of the bad compromises come from good intentions. I think there are two major good intentions that we have that become distorted. And with those distortions, Satan is working on us. And with those distortions, he's leading us to that bad compromise, to look at something as acceptable, look at it as normal. And one of those is love your neighbor. I mean, that's important to us as believers in Christ, isn't it? To love your neighbor. The other one we're going to talk about is unity of the faith. Another very important principle to believers, because it's taught very clearly in Scripture that we're to have unity of the faith. Both of those things are easily distorted, and they are distorted every day. So with this one, with your love our neighbor, we're to love our neighbor, no question about it, not going to argue that point. We know that's for sure. But how can it be distorted so that we might make bad compromises, where we might accept something that's deviant, and then even find what's deviant is normal?
Don't want to hurt their feelings.
If we have a close friend who's going down the wrong path, and we know that we should say something to that friend in order to bring them back to the right path, we are many times reluctant to say that. Now, you may not be, but the majority of us are. We are very reluctant to say something. One of the reasons is we're afraid they're going to hurt their feelings. We're afraid there might be some repercussions to the friendship. I mean, there are all kinds of rationalizations we might give ourselves. But in fact, we have a responsibility to that fellow believer to treat them the way that we would want to be treated. Initially, we don't want to be bothered. We want to be treated well. We want everybody to love us. We want everybody to think that we're perfect, but we know that we're not. If we step back far enough, we really want people to correct us when we're wrong so that we can get back on the right path. And if we really love somebody, then we're going to be willing to step out and to do that for them. You do it for children, don't you? If your child is misbehaving and you know that that's detrimental to them in the long term, do you sit on your hands and say, well, I don't want to hurt his feelings? Poor little darling. You don't do that. And the same should be true for the way that we treat our brothers and sisters in Christ. Love your neighbor as yourself. Isn't that what he said? Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, if I'm going down a path of destruction, I want somebody to say, wait a minute, don't go there. That bridge is out. You're going down for sure if you stay on that path. I want somebody to tell me that. But what we do in distorting this is, well, you have to be nice to everybody. We do have to be nice to everybody. We have to love everybody. But we have to do it in a way that is constructive also, and not allow their destruction if we can do anything to prevent it. So we distort that idea of love your neighbor to the point where people don't want to do anything that they should do. What about this unity of the faith? In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul talks about attaining unity of the faith. That's an objective of the church. We want unity of the faith, believing these principles that Jesus teaches through the Scripture. But in the world around us today, you hear a lot of talk about unity of the faith. You have Christian churches inviting Muslim imams to preach, to come up and preach. Is that unity of the faith? I'm starting to preach and you're afraid to say anything, aren't you?
Oh, you're waiting for an answer.
Just like love your neighbor becomes distorted to the point where we don't want to do anything that might possibly offend anybody. We take the unity of the faith to the point also that it means we have everybody coming to the belief that maybe we're all going to the same place and worshiping the same God. We just have different paths to get there. Isn't that a distortion of unity of the faith? And yet that's what we hear, isn't it? There are lots of variations of this, but both of those things are Satan at work in the lives of believers to keep them from doing what they're supposed to do. In other words, to compromise on the deviance. That which is deviant, accept that. In fact, treat it as normal and wait for the disaster. I believe there's a progression of bad compromises. Now, I don't know if that question makes any sense to you or not, but I think there's a progression of these bad compromises. Can you see any progression of bad compromises?
World War II.
World War II? Okay, you compromise here, and then you compromise a little bit more, and you compromise a little bit more, and you keep going farther and farther down, getting deeper and deeper into the hole, until you finally actually fall into the hole itself. I mean, that's what the engineers at NASA did with Challenger and Columbia. A compromise a little bit more, a little more tolerant, we'll let it have a little bit more foam fall off, we'll let a little bit more happen. So we become a little more tolerant, we become more accepting of what's going on until we finally think, okay, this is all normal, it's not a big deal, nothing's going wrong here, it's a normal thing. So there is this progression of the bad compromises. And that's what we're going to see with our story today. And it's an easy slide. Make one little compromise, Satan is right there to help you make another one. Make that one, he's right there to help you make the next one. And you slowly slide down. A good example of this, I think, is if you take a teenager who shoplifts for the first time. Take a teenager raised in a decent home, and they decide to shoplift for the first time. Is it normally easy for that child to decide to do that the first time? I would think not. All kinds of fears would come up in their mind. What if I get caught? And what are my parents going to do to me if I do this and I get caught? Anyway, so they go through some process of struggling to make the decision, but they finally make the compromise, I'm going to do it. How about the second time they do it? Is it easier or harder?
Easier.
It's easier. The third time, hey, I'm getting this thing down now. It's not only acceptable, after a few more times, it's going to be normal. I can do this anytime I want to. So we slide all the way down until it doesn't work anymore. Quick film clip for you this morning is taken from the movie Taken. It's Liam Neeson. In this one, there's a very good sequence of events showing some compromise on the part of Neeson. Neeson is a retired CIA agent, and because he was in the CIA and spent a lot of time overseas, he didn't have much time with his family, and so his wife divorced him 10 years earlier than this movie. They had, at that time, a daughter of about 6 or 7, and in the movie, he has now retired from the CIA and wants to spend time with his daughter, even though his parents have divorced and she's remarried. He wants to spend some time with his daughter to make up for that time that he lost while he was out defending the country. So he is very interested in establishing a real relationship with his daughter. I mean, that's what's driving him. So you're going to see 3 scenes. First scene is where he delivers a birthday present to his daughter's 17th birthday party at the home of his former wife and her husband. Then you're going to see a scene in a restaurant where the daughter comes to make a proposal to him. She has something she wants to do. She needs his assistance in it. And you're going to see him faced with a dilemma, a decision to make, how far he's willing to bend to meet his daughter's expectations, this daughter with whom he wants to establish this new, stronger relationship. And then you're going to see how this compromise develops over the next couple of pieces. All of our decisions are like that, aren't they? Where we have pressures on the outside from somebody close to us sometimes, to compromise. Your principles are here, but you really need to do this because of all these reasons. We feel like we're being forced to compromise. But the question for most of us is, when we find that our compromise has started to go wrong, as he learns here, as he sees the itinerary, this is not going the way that we agreed, what do you do? Most of the time, we've made a compromise here. Well, this is just one little step, and so we'll go ahead and do that one too. And that's what he did, and the problems exploded. His shuttle exploded a little farther into the movie. But anyway, it's an illustration of what we are saying. And we want to meet the players in our story this morning. We're going to be dealing with Jehoshaphat and Ahab. The kingdom is divided. We're looking in the 9th century BC. Southern kingdom of Judah, northern kingdom of Israel. Some other pieces. We're going to have the Syrians causing a problem over here on the east side of the Jordan. And we're going to talk about Sidon, which is the territory labeled Phoenicia here, and Ramoth Gilead, which is down here. The characters are Ahab, king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Evil man, bad as they get. He married the daughter of the king of Sidon, not an Israelite. Going outside the family, marrying this person. Not only that, she is a Baal worshiper. She is really an evil person. I mean, he is bad. She's even worse. This is the kind of person we deal with. So Ahab himself sets up Baal worship as the standard in the northern kingdom of Israel. Builds a temple, an altar, the whole bit. So that Baal worship is the normal worship for the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, at this time. Jehoshaphat, king of the south, follows his father Asa, who was a good king, and instituted reforms, clearing out a lot of the Baal worship and all this. And Jehoshaphat continues that cleansing process, removing a lot of the idol worship away from the southern kingdom of Judah. He is a follower of God, an honest man, a godly man. And that's what's important for us today as we look at this godly man facing these issues and compromising. So just as this godly man compromised, we're capable of compromising the same way, facing similar catastrophic results. He's a good guy. He is a good king. God honors him. There is no war during these early years of his reign. In fact, the nations honor him. They bring him gifts. Even the Philistines over on the coast, natural enemies of the Israelites ever since they came in the land, the Philistines are bringing him gifts. Almost every other king is fighting the Philistines all the time. They're bringing him gifts. So things are going well in the southern kingdom. Now we come to the story. Just a little before this, a little more background. You remember the story perhaps of Elijah facing Ahab and his prophets of Baal up on Mount Carmel? That was about 10 years before where we are now, where we're going to be talking about this. So Elijah had killed hundreds and hundreds of prophets of Baal. Ahab saw it happen. Jezebel was really angry about the whole thing, threatened to kill Elijah. It's a critical point here about Baal worship in the north. And now we have Jehoshaphat, this good king in the south. A few years into his reign, he has one of his sons marry one of the daughters of Ahab and Jezebel. Jehoram is the son, his oldest son, who will be his successor. He has his eldest son marry this daughter of Jezebel, who is just as bad as her mother. Now, one might hope by such a marriage that he would be winning the northern kingdom toward God. I mean, why would we seek this unity? I mean, this is a good thing, right? I mean, reuniting the kingdom. You know, the kingdom of the north, kingdom of the south, they've had this civil war. Now we bring them back. Is an attempt to bring them back together. Well, are you really going to bring back together the worship of God and the worship of Baal? That's not going to happen. Nonetheless, this marriage has taken place between Jehoram and Athaliah, the daughter of Jezebel and Ahab. This is the situation. Here's Jehoshaphat, this king that has all these blessings, doing extremely well in the south. And then he's going into this marriage, hoping perhaps to reestablish the kingdom, maybe loving his neighbor, unifying the kingdom. Whatever the distortions, it's not real and it's not going to work. And after some years, he goes down to Samaria. Now, elevation of Jerusalem is high, so whenever you leave Jerusalem, it doesn't matter which direction you go, you're going down. See, when we say we're going down, we're going south. We go up, we go north. That's not true here. In Jerusalem, wherever you go, you're going down. So he goes down to Ahab in Samaria. He goes down to visit his new in-laws. We want to solidify this relationship, apparently. They now have been united through this marriage. Let's see if we can make this even stronger. Well, now, if it's in fact to help remove Baal worship from Israel, that's one thing, but that is apparently not the goal. So he goes down to visit with Ahab in Samaria. It's another compromise because you don't go there unless there's a good purpose for doing so, not for a social call. Takes the next step. While he's there, Ahab says, oh, by the way, we're having a little problem on the east side of the Jordan. The Syrians have come down and they've taken the city of Ramoth Gilead. And what I want to do is take it back, and so I'd like for you to help me. Would you go help me take back this city from the Syrians? Here's Jehoshaphat joined to Ahab in this marriage. He's gone down for a social visit, has a big party going on. What are you going to say? Well, I guess maybe I was wrong and all this other stuff. I'm going home. You're on your own, buddy. Or, well, we've come this far. Yeah, okay. I'm just like you are. We're descendants of Abraham. I love my neighbor. And I guess that means I have to go to war with him if he wants to go to war. After all, if we're going to unify the kingdom, then, I have to back him. I am as you are, and my people are as your people. Now, we are one. We are unified. It's another compromise, just one more step, going one step farther, saying not only have we been joined through this marriage, but we're going to join together at the hip and go into battle together. This evil king, Ahab, this good king, Jehoshaphat. One more compromise. Jehoshaphat probably is having some second thoughts about this. Maybe this isn't really a good idea. And so he says to Ahab, let's consult God. Maybe we're a little late in doing that because he's already agreed that he'll go with him. But he says, okay, let's consult God. Ahab says, fine, I have 400 prophets. Now he's replaced all those hundreds and hundreds of prophets that Elijah killed, and he's found some new ones, new speakers for the gods. 400 of them. He says, fine, I'll call my 400 prophets. And they all come in shouting the same thing. Oh, great King Ahab, you're wonderful. They can't defeat you. You go. Victory is yours. All of them. Jehoshaphat doesn't think that spells right. And so he looks at this and says, I don't know. Maybe we need to ask someone else. Jehoshaphat demands to hear from somebody else. Ahab says, fine, there is another prophet. I don't like him because he doesn't like me. He doesn't prophesy things that I like. He doesn't prophesy good things about me. If I'm the king, he should say good things about me, right? He won't do that. But I'll call him just for you. They call Micaiah. Micaiah comes up to Ahab and says, sorry, but it's not going to go well. It's going to be a disaster. Your rocket will explode. Ahab is so upset that he has Micaiah thrown in jail. And they tell him to only give him bread and water until he gets back from the battle, and then he'll deal with him as a false prophet and probably execute him. Because he'll show that, hey, you're a false prophet. You said I wouldn't make it back, but here I am. Now, if you're Jehoshaphat, what in the world are you thinking now? Here was a prophet who said something else. This is going to end in disaster. And Ahab has thrown him into jail. Would you think that maybe it's time to call this off? Maybe I have made some bad compromises along the way, and it's time to go back. But we don't do that, do we? We've made all these steps incrementally. This is what Satan does so well. Incrementally, he has led us down this path. Well, just one more. Jehoshaphat went with him. Now, we sit here and think that's unbelievable, except we do the same kind of stuff. And if we didn't, then we could say, yeah, that's unbelievable. But we can't. It's all too believable. That's our human nature. We have committed this much. We found this acceptable. Now it's becoming normal. And so, hey, here we are. We're united to him so much that even though all this garbage is going on, I have a prophecy of destruction, I'm still going to go with him. And he does. Good king, godly king, matched up, hooked up with this evil king. Well, then it's not over. Ahab says, oh, one more thing. We're getting ready to go into battle. One more thing. I'm going to dress as a regular soldier, and you wear the royal robes of a king into battle. Now, we probably don't have to think about that too long to figure that this really isn't going to be a good thing. But if you've made these compromises, what's the big deal about just wearing your robes into the battle, which you would normally do anyway, and letting him dress as a regular soldier? I mean, it's not a big deal, is it? Doesn't seem like one on the surface as you're just going through the steps. Satan just says, oh, one more thing. One more little compromise. That's all we need. And Jehoshaphat says, okay. And that's what happens. They go into battle. The king of the Syrians has said, okay, normal soldiers, fight your battle. You guys with the chariots, I want you to find the king, go get him and kill the king of Israel. They spot Jehoshaphat in the robes, think that's the king of Israel. They go after him and try to kill him. Jehoshaphat, realizing that he's the object of all this attention and is likely to die, cries out for help. And it doesn't say to whom he cries, but God answered, and God diverted the chariots away from him so that he could escape. Ahab, on the other hand, was killed. Ahab was killed in the battle. Jehoshaphat escaped because of God's hand, in spite of the foolish compromises by Jehoshaphat. Fortunately, God has rescued us in many ways from our foolishness in the foolish compromises that we make. But still, there's a price. When Jehoshaphat gets home, a prophet comes out to meet him. Jehu comes out to meet him and says, you have messed up. Should you help the wicked and love those who hate God? I mean, that's what you were doing down in Samaria. You were helping the evil one and loving those who hate me. Is that what you should do? Because of that, the wrath of God has come against you. Now here is the king, the good king, godly king, with all the blessings of God being poured upon him, going through this series of bad compromises with Ahab, and now the wrath of God is on him. The rest of his reign was marked by war. The peace was lost because God said, you will pay a penalty for what you have done. You know, God may rescue us and we may still have a price to pay, as Jehoshaphat had a price to pay. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is getting ready to send his disciples out. He has the 12 gathered together and he's ready to send them out. And he says to them, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves. In other words, you're going out into some dangerous territory. You're to be my witnesses, but you're going out as among wolves. And they didn't love me. They hated me, and they've tried to do terrible things to me, and they're going to do the same to you. Don't expect different treatment than the master. And then he says, to everyone who acknowledges me, the American Standard Version says, confesses me. Whoever acknowledges me or confesses me before men, I will acknowledge or confess before the Father. But whoever does not acknowledge or confess me before men, I will not acknowledge or confess before the Father. So if we're going out as those witnesses, all of disciples, as those 12 were called to be witnesses, we as his disciples are called to be his witnesses as well. That's part of our calling, to witness for him. Now, sometimes when we hear that word, we get a little antsy because we've seen, hey, there are the 6 steps for being a witness. You've got to memorize these, do these things, when you're going to witness to anybody. I say nonsense to that. It's a lot simpler. We are witnesses to what we know. Just as if you are called to be a witness in a court trial, you go to speak what you know. And you are his witnesses to tell people what you know. What has he done in your life? What have you seen him do? That's what you witness to. That's simple. That's straightforward, what you know. But we are to expect the opposition. We're sheep among wolves. The world has not gotten any better. May have gotten worse, but the world has not gotten any better from the time when Jesus sent out the 12. So we are to expect the opposition. It's going to be there. Satan uses that opposition. That's what he uses to tempt us to distort the meaning of love your neighbor and the meaning of attaining unity of the faith. You see, because of this opposition, I have to be careful now how I deal with people. I can't speak the truth to them. I have to modify it a little bit for the audience. That's a distortion of the truth. So I have to expect the opposition. Satan is going to use that opposition to entice us to compromise on our witness. But the danger of that is what Jesus said. If you don't acknowledge him, if you are not being a true witness for him, there is a danger of a greater cost. There is a cost for that bad compromise. And you don't want it to be that ultimate cost of separation from the family of God, which is for those who will not acknowledge him before men.
I love to tell the story. 'Twill be my theme in glory to tell the old story of Jesus and his love.